I used to believe I could save people. Not in the dramatic superhero sense, nothing like that. I mean in the quiet, steady way therapists tell themselves they're making a difference. 50-minute sessions, active listening, evidence-based interventions. I'd sit across from someone drowning in their own mind and think, if I just say the right thing, ask the right question, maybe they'll find solid ground. For years, I actually thought it was working. The office was on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone in Brooklyn, the kind of place where the radiator clanged every morning like it was angry about something. My waiting room had 2 chairs, a fake plant I kept forgetting to dust, and a white noise machine that hummed just loud enough to cover the sound of someone crying in the next room. I saw 8 clients a day, sometimes 9 if someone was in crisis. Depression, anxiety, trauma, grief. The usual catalogue of human suffering, each one wrapped in its own particular shape of pain. I remember this one guy, Marcus, mid-30s, worked in finance, couldn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. He'd sit there in my office every Tuesday at 4, tie loosened, telling me about the nightmares. Always the same one. He's in a meeting room with glass walls and everyone's watching him, and he can't remember what he's supposed to say. He'd wake up sweating, heart hammering, convinced he was dying. We worked on it for months. Cognitive restructuring, exposure therapy, sleep hygiene, all the tools I'd been trained to use. Then, one Tuesday, he didn't show up. No call, no text. I figured maybe he was sick or caught up at work, but he didn't show the next week either. When I finally reached his emergency contact, his sister, she told me he'd checked himself into an inpatient facility upstate. Severe depressive episode. She said it so calmly, like she was telling me he'd gone on vacation. She thanked me for trying, which somehow made it worse. That's when the doubt started. Not loud, not dramatic. Just this quiet whisper in the back of my mind during sessions. What if I'm not actually helping? What if I'm just a well-meaning person with a degree, sitting in a room, watching people suffer and pretending my words matter? The whisper got louder. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The clients who came back week after week with the same problems, the ones who smiled and said they were doing better, but whose eyes told a different story, the ones who stopped coming, and I never knew why. I began staying later at the office, reviewing my notes, second-guessing every intervention. Should I have pushed harder, been gentler, referred them out sooner? My wife, Sarah, noticed. Of course she did. She'd find me at midnight in our home office, laptop open, reading research articles about treatment efficacy like I'd find some secret I'd missed in grad school. She'd stand in the doorway in her pajamas and say my name soft enough that I could pretend not to hear if I wanted to keep hiding. You can't save everyone, she told me one night. We were in bed, lights off, and I could feel her looking at me, even though I was staring at the ceiling. You know that, right? That's not how this works. I did know that. Intellectually, I knew that. They'd hammered it into us in training, boundaries, realistic expectations, the limits of what therapy can do, but knowing something in your head and believing it in your gut are different things. I kept thinking about Marcus in that facility, about all the people I'd failed without even realizing I was failing them. The burnout didn't announce itself with trumpets. It was gradual, like going blind 1 degree at a time. I started dreading the sound of my office phone. Started arriving exactly at session time instead of early, started counting down the minutes until I could leave. My supervisor noticed during our monthly check-in, asked if I was taking care of myself, suggested I might need to see someone. The irony wasn't lost on me. The therapist needs therapy. I laughed it off, said I was fine, just tired. I wasn't fine. I was hollow. Every session felt like performance art, me playing the role of competent professional, while inside I was screaming that I had no idea what I was doing. I'd nod and reflect and validate, and all the while this voice in my head was saying, "You're a fraud. You're taking these people's money and time and giving them nothing. You're making it worse." 6 months after Marcus disappeared, I quit. Just like that. I told my clients I was closing my practice, gave them referrals, finished out their sessions with a smile that felt like plastic. Some of them cried. One woman, Jennifer, who'd been seeing me for 2 years for childhood trauma, asked if it was something she'd done. That question still sits in my chest like a stone. I told her no, of course not. It was about me needing a change, which was true, but also the biggest lie I've ever told. Sarah was supportive in that way people are when they don't really understand, but love you enough to pretend. She said maybe it was time for something new. Maybe I could do research or teaching instead. I nodded and agreed, and spent the next 3 months on the couch, not doing research or teaching, just existing in this grey space where nothing mattered and everything felt heavy. Our son, Daniel, was 7. He had Sarah's eyes, this bright, clear blue that made you think of summer sky, and my tendency to ask too many questions. He'd come home from school and tell me elaborate stories about his day, about the frog they found during recess or the girl who brought in cupcakes for her birthday. I'd listen and nod and try to be present, but I was somewhere else, locked in my own head, replaying every failed session, every client I couldn't help. Daniel didn't seem to notice I was different. Or maybe he did, and was too young to know what it meant. He'd climb onto the couch next to me and shove his iPad in my face, showing me videos of people building things in Minecraft, and I'd watch without really seeing. Sarah noticed, though. I could feel her watching us. This little crease appearing between her eyebrows that meant she was worried, but didn't want to say anything yet. It was March when it happened. One of those days where winter's giving up, but spring hasn't quite arrived, so everything's grey and damp and uncertain. Daniel had a field trip to the Natural History Museum. Sarah was supposed to go as a chaperone, but she'd gotten called in for an emergency at work. She was a nurse at Mount Sinai, so I went instead. I remember standing in our kitchen that morning, packing Daniel's lunch. Peanut butter and jelly, because that's all he'd eat. Apple slices, a juice box. He was upstairs brushing his teeth and I could hear him singing something, some song from a show he watched. Sarah kissed my cheek on her way out, told me to have fun, said she'd be home by 6. Normal. Everything was so devastatingly normal. The museum was chaos. 32nd graders running around shouting about dinosaurs and gems and the blue whale hanging from the ceiling. I tried to keep track of Daniel and the 3 other kids I'd been assigned, but they kept scattering like marbles. The teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, kept doing head counts, her voice getting shriller each time. We made it through the dinosaur halls, the minerals and gems, the African mammals. Daniel was fascinated by everything, pulling my hand, asking why. Why did the dinosaurs die? Why are rubies red? Why do elephants have trunks? By lunch, I was exhausted in that particular way you get when you're around that many children. We ate in the cafeteria, sitting at long tables, and I watched Daniel trade his apple slices for someone's Oreos, which Sarah would have stopped, but I was too tired to care about. The other parent chaperones made small talk. Weather, schools, plans for spring break. I smiled and nodded and felt like I was watching it all from behind glass. After lunch, we were supposed to stay together as a group, but Daniel needed the bathroom. I told Ms. Rodriguez, and she waved us off, distracted by a kid who'd dropped his lunch on the floor. The bathrooms were down a long hallway, past the gift shop, around a corner. Daniel went in while I waited outside, checking my phone for no reason, just something to do with my hands. He was taking a while. I knocked, called his name. A kid came out, not Daniel, shrugged when I asked if there was another boy in there. I went in, checked the stalls. Empty. My heart did this little jump, but I told myself not to panic. He probably went back to find the group. Kids get confused in big buildings. I walked back toward the cafeteria. Faster now. The hallways all looked the same. Marble floors, high ceilings, exhibits behind glass. I couldn't remember if we'd turned right or left. I asked a security guard if he'd seen a boy, 7 years old, red jacket. He shook his head, said to check the information desk. The information desk said to check with security. I was starting to sweat despite the air conditioning. I found Ms. Rodriguez in the Hall of Ocean Life, underneath the blue whale. She did a head count. Daniel wasn't there. Her face changed. She got on her radio, called for more teachers, started organizing the other parents to search. I was moving through the museum, calling Daniel's name, checking every room, every corner. Other visitors started looking too, museum staff, everyone. 30 minutes passed, an hour. The museum made announcements over the PA system. Security locked the exits. Police came. They asked me questions. What was he wearing? Did he have any medical conditions? Did he know our address? I answered everything in this weird, calm voice that didn't sound like mine. Sarah called. I had to tell her. I heard her scream through the phone. They found him in the emergency stairwell on the north side of the building. He'd somehow gotten separated, gotten confused, opened a door that shouldn't have been unlocked. The stairwell was under construction, barriers up, but not secured properly. He'd fallen. 4 flights. The medical examiner said it was instant. He didn't suffer. People say that like it helps. The funeral was on a Thursday. I don't remember most of it. Just fragments. The small casket, Sarah's mother holding her up, the priest saying something about God's plan. I stood there in a black suit I'd borrowed from my brother and felt nothing. Not grief, not anger, not anything. Just this vast emptiness, like someone had scooped out my insides and left the shell standing. Everyone expected me to fall apart. I didn't. I went through the motions, made phone calls, signed papers, met with the lawyers about the lawsuit against the museum. I did all of it with this eerie calm that made people uncomfortable. Sarah fell apart enough for both of us. She'd cry for hours, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I'd sit next to her on the bed, hand on her back, feeling like I was watching someone else's tragedy. The guilt came later. Not the obvious kind, that I'd been there, that I'd let him go to the bathroom alone, that I hadn't found him fast enough. That guilt was expected, almost manageable. No, the real guilt was deeper. I started thinking about all those months I'd spent on the couch, barely present, drowning in my own failure as a therapist. All that time I could have spent with Daniel. All those questions I'd only half answered. All those moments I'd been physically there but mentally somewhere else. And then, the thought that really broke me. I'd spent years trying to help strangers with their problems, and I couldn't even protect my own son. What was the point of any of it? What had I actually accomplished? A bunch of people sitting in a room with me talking about their feelings while my kid was home needing a father who was actually present. I'd failed everyone, my clients, my son, myself. Sarah and I lasted another year. We tried in that way people do when they've lost the thing that held them together but don't want to admit it's over. We went to grief counseling, ironic, right? Sat across from a soft-spoken woman who asked us to share our feelings. I couldn't. Every time I tried to talk about Daniel, my throat would close up. Sarah would cry and talk, and the therapist would nod sympathetically, and I'd sit there like a statue, contributing nothing, just like I'd contributed nothing to my client's healing. We sold the house in Brooklyn. Too many memories. Daniel's room, the kitchen where I'd packed his last lunch, the couch where I'd wasted months while he was alive. We got an apartment in Queens, smaller, cheaper. Sarah went back to work. I didn't. I had the insurance settlement from the museum lawsuit, enough to live on for a while, enough that I didn't have to think about what came next. I started avoiding things. Subways at first. The screeching brakes reminded me of how I'd screamed Daniel's name in those museum hallways. Then museums, obviously. Then schools. Parks where kids played. Restaurants with children's menus. The world became this minefield of reminders, and I learned to navigate around them, staying in my safe, small perimeter. Sarah asked for a divorce 2 years after Daniel died. We were eating takeout Chinese in our tiny kitchen, and she said it mid-bite, like she'd been holding it in so long it just escaped. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "I feel like I'm living with a ghost." I didn't argue. She was right. I'd stopped being a person and become this empty thing that moved through space without purpose. The divorce was quick, civil. We didn't have much to fight over. She took most of the furniture. I kept the settlement money and some books. She told me she hoped I'd find help, hoped I'd find peace. I nodded and lied and said I would. She moved to New Jersey to be near her sister. I stayed in the Queens apartment. That's when the real isolation started. Days would pass where I wouldn't speak to anyone. I'd wake up around noon, eat something from the deli downstairs, watch TV until my eyes hurt, sleep, repeat. I stopped answering my phone, stopped checking email. My brother would come by sometimes, knock on the door until I answered, bring groceries I hadn't asked for. He'd try to talk to me, ask if I was okay, suggest I see someone. I'd nod and agree, and wait for him to leave. I thought about ending it a few times. Nothing dramatic, Just the quiet acknowledgement that I could, if I wanted, that it would be easier than this half-life I was living. But I never did. Not because of hope or faith or any noble reason. Just inertia. Even suicide requires energy, requires making a decision, and I couldn't seem to make decisions anymore. 5 years passed like that. 5 years of nothing. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror and be surprised by how old I looked. Grey in my beard I didn't remember getting. Lines around my eyes. I was 41 but looked 50. Then came the day that changed everything. It was October, one of those perfect fall days in New York where the air's crisp and the light hits the buildings just right. I'd run out of coffee, the one thing I cared about having in the apartment, and forced myself to walk to the bodega 6 blocks away. 6 blocks. That's how small my world had become. I was walking back, paper cup warming my hands, when I saw the train station. The elevated tracks on Queens Boulevard, trains rumbling overhead every few minutes. I'd been avoiding it for 5 years, taking a longer route to the bodega even though this way was more direct. But that day, for some reason, I didn't turn away. I stood there on the sidewalk, looking up at the stairs leading to the platform. My therapist brain, the part I'd thought was dead, stirred. "This is exposure," it said. "This is how you begin to heal. You face the thing you've been avoiding." I almost laughed. After 5 years of nothing, my brain decides to offer advice now. I climbed the stairs. My legs felt weak, heart pounding harder than the effort warranted. The platform was crowded, afternoon rush starting, people heading home from work or school. The announcements crackled over the speakers, trains arriving and departing, doors closing, stand clear. All of it eerily familiar, like a language I'd forgotten I spoke. I stood near the edge, not too close, feeling the vibration of an approaching train through the platform floor. The roar as it pulled in, the hydraulic hiss of doors opening, the surge of people exiting and entering. I watched it all like I was studying something foreign. The train left, the crowd thinned. I was about to leave too, head back down to my safe, small apartment, when I saw him. A man, maybe 30, standing closer to the edge than anyone should. Too close. He was swaying slightly, hands in his pockets, staring down at the tracks with an expression I recognized because I'd seen it in my mirror. Everything in me said to look away, to leave, to not get involved. I wasn't equipped to help anyone. I couldn't even help myself. But I kept watching him. He took his hands out of his pockets, took a small step forward, toes touching the yellow warning line. Another announcement. Train approaching, 2 minutes out. The platform was filling up again. People positioning themselves by the doors, checking phones, talking, oblivious. This man was standing there like he was alone in the universe. I could see his chest rising and falling, fast, panicked. He took another tiny step. His toes were over the yellow line now. I don't know why I moved. There was no conscious decision, no heroic impulse. One moment I was frozen, the next I was walking toward him, fast. The rumble of the approaching train was getting louder, that distinctive sound you feel in your bones. People were looking at their phones, at the tunnel, at each other. No one was looking at him. "Hey," I said. My voice came out rusty, too quiet. I got closer. "Hey, you okay?" He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me at all. His whole body was rigid, like he was gathering courage. The train's light appeared in the tunnel, that bright headlight cutting through the darkness. 30 seconds, maybe. I reached out, grabbed his arm. Not hard, not pulling, just contact. Just enough that he turned and looked at me. His eyes were empty. That's what broke through my fog, the recognition of my own emptiness reflected back at me. "Don't," I said. Simple. One word. The train was getting closer, the wind picking up, debris swirling. People were moving toward the edge, ready to board. He was still looking at me, and I saw something shift in his face. Not hope, exactly. Just awareness. Like he'd been underwater, and suddenly remembered he could breathe. I pulled him back gently away from the edge. He didn't resist. We stumbled backward together, and the train roared past where he'd been standing, doors opening, people flooding out and in. We were both breathing hard, standing there in the middle of the platform, while everyone flowed around us like water. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was hoarse. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's okay," I said, which was inadequate and probably not true. "You're okay." He was crying now, silent tears running down his face. I kept my hand on his arm, steady, the way I used to hold space for clients in my office. A transit cop appeared, drawn by our stillness in the chaos. I explained what happened, my voice surprisingly calm. The cop took over, gentle but professional, calling for backup, moving us to a bench. They took the man to the hospital. Standard protocol for suicide attempts. I gave my statement to the cops, my name and number in case they needed to follow up. They thanked me, called me a hero, which felt wrong. Heroes don't wait 5 years to do something good. Heroes don't let their kids die while they're drowning in their own self-pity. But as I walked back down the station stairs to the street, something was different. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. I felt awake. For the first time in 5 years, I felt something other than numbness. Terror, maybe, adrenaline. But underneath that, something else. Something I couldn't quite name. I went home and couldn't sit still. I paced my apartment, that tiny space I'd been hiding in, and it suddenly felt like a cage. I called my brother. When he answered, surprised to hear from me, I started crying. Real, ugly crying. The kind I hadn't allowed myself since the funeral. I told him about the man on the platform, about saving him, about how I didn't deserve to save anyone. He listened, didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it, just listened the way I used to listen to clients. When I finished, exhausted, he said, "Maybe it's not about deserving. Maybe it's just about being there when someone needs you." That night, I dreamed about Daniel. First time in months. We were in the museum, but it wasn't scary. We were just walking through the dinosaur halls, and he was asking his endless questions, and I was answering them, really answering, present and focused. When I woke up, my face was wet, but it wasn't just sadness. It was something more complicated. Grief, yes, but also gratitude that I'd had him at all, even briefly, that I'd loved him, even if I'd been too lost in my own head to show it well. I started therapy the next week, a different kind of therapy than I'd been trained in, trauma-focused, intensive. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Chen, didn't let me hide behind professional jargon or intellectualizing. She made me sit with the uncomfortable feelings, the guilt, the rage at myself, the unbearable sorrow of losing Daniel. It was brutal. I cried more in those first few sessions than I had in 5 years. But I kept going. I started walking more, expanding my radius. 6 blocks became 10, became 20. I started taking the train again, practicing being in that space without falling apart. It was hard. Some days I'd get halfway up the stairs and have to turn back. But I kept trying. I looked up the man from the platform. His name was James. The hospital connected us. He'd given permission for me to contact him. We met for coffee 6 months after that day. He looked different, healthier, with that cautious hope people get when they're climbing out of their darkness. He told me his story. Lost his job, ended a long relationship, depression spiraling. He said that day on the platform, he'd been invisible to everyone except me. "You saw me," he said. "I don't know how to thank you for that." I wanted to tell him I knew what invisibility felt like, that I'd been invisible to myself for years. Instead, I said, "You did the hard part. You chose to step back." We stayed in touch. Not best friends, nothing dramatic, just occasional texts, checking in. He got into a treatment program, found a new job, started running marathons. He invited me to watch him finish his first one, and I went, stood in the crowd and cheered for this stranger who wasn't a stranger anymore. When he crossed the finish line, exhausted and triumphant, I thought about second chances, about how broken people can sometimes help each other become less broken. I started volunteering. Nothing therapeutic. I wasn't ready for that. Might never be. But I joined a crisis hotline, answering calls from people in their darkest moments. It was different from therapy. No 50-minute sessions, no treatment plans. Just being present for someone who needed not to be alone right then. Some nights I'd take 20 calls, some nights none. But I showed up and that mattered. Dr. Chen asked me once what changed that day on the platform, why after 5 years of isolation, I'd chosen to act. I didn't have a good answer. Maybe it was seeing my own despair in someone else's eyes. Maybe it was muscle memory from all those years in the therapy chair. Maybe it was just random chance, neurons firing in a different pattern for once. Or maybe, I thought but didn't say, maybe I'd been waiting for permission to come back to life. And seeing someone else on that edge, I realized I had a choice. I could keep drowning in my own guilt, or I could use this pain for something. Not to erase it. You can't erase losing your child, you can't undo that damage. But to make it mean something beyond just destruction. I'll never stop missing Daniel. That hole in my life is permanent. There are still days I can barely breathe under the weight of what I lost, of my failures as a father and a therapist and a human being. But I've learned to carry it differently, not as punishment, but as proof that I loved him, that he mattered, that his brief, bright life changed mine in ways I'm still discovering. Last month, I went back to the Natural History Museum, first time since that March day 8 years ago. I stood in the Hall of Ocean Life under the blue whale where Ms. Rodriguez had been when I couldn't find Daniel. A father was there with his daughter, maybe 6 years old, and she was asking him why whales sing. He knelt down to her level, patient and present, and explained about whale calls traveling through water. I watched them, and it hurt. But it was a bearable hurt, a human hurt. I found the emergency stairwell where they'd found Daniel. They'd fixed it, of course, locked the door properly, added barriers, settled the lawsuit. I stood outside it for a long time, just breathing. Then I put my hand on the door, whispered, "I'm sorry," and walked away. Here's what I've learned. You don't get over losing a child. You don't heal from that kind of wound, but you can learn to live beside it. You can find moments of light that don't erase the darkness, but make it less absolute. You can save one person on a train platform and not save your son, and both things can be true. And you can be both a failure and a decent person trying, and all of it can exist together. I'm not the therapist I was. That version of me is gone, dead in the rubble of my old life. But I'm learning to be someone new, someone who knows what it's like to fall and to get back up. Someone who can stand next to another broken person and say, "I see you, you're not invisible, and maybe neither of us has to do this alone." The crisis hotline tonight was quiet. Only 3 calls. One woman having a panic attack, one teenager worried about his parents' divorce, one older man who just wanted someone to talk to because his wife died 6 months ago, and the silence was killing him. I talked to each of them, held space for their pain, reminded them they weren't alone. When I hung up after the last call, I felt tired but not empty, tired in the way you feel after doing something hard and worthwhile. I walked home along Queens Boulevard, under the elevated tracks. A train rumbled overhead and I didn't flinch. I thought about James, about his marathon, about second chances. I thought about Daniel, about his blue eyes and endless questions. I thought about all the people I couldn't save and the one I could. I thought about how life is impossibly cruel and occasionally, unexpectedly kind. If you're reading this, if you've stayed with me through this long, messy story, maybe you know what it's like to lose something you can't get back. Maybe you've failed people you loved. Maybe you're standing on your own platform edge right now, wondering if it's worth stepping back. I can't tell you it gets easy. It doesn't. But I can tell you that you're not alone in this, even when it feels like you are. I can tell you that sometimes the broken parts of us are what help us connect to other broken people. And I can tell you that choosing to stay, choosing to step back from that edge, is the hardest and bravest thing you'll ever do. There are other people out there who need to hear they're seen, who need someone to grab their arm and say, "Don't." Just that one simple word. Maybe you can be that person for someone, someday. Maybe someone will be that for you. Maybe we're all just stumbling around in the dark, occasionally finding each other, occasionally offering our hand. If this story meant something to you, if it made you feel less alone or gave you hope or just reminded you that pain can coexist with purpose, then stay with this channel. Subscribe. Not for me, but because there are more stories like this one, more reminders that we're all struggling and surviving and occasionally saving each other. Because the world needs people who understand darkness and still choose light. because second chances exist, even when we think we don't deserve them, and because sometimes the person you save might end up being yourself.